Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
Hello. We're continuing our study in 2 Samuel. Today we're going to be in the literary unit of chapters 13 and 14 that deal with Absalom. Now, Absalom is the third son of David. There seems to be a tension in this chapter between Amnon, the first son of David. Now, the second son, after he's mentioned as one of David's sons, he's never mentioned again. He must have died in early childhood. And the third son, Absalom. 13 and 14 are a part of a larger literary unit known as the succession account. And although David may have said that Solomon was going to succeed him, he never publicized that. And his oldest sons are vying for the position. Now, it seems hard to know in this particular pericope if the problem is politically motivated or revenge motivated over what Amnon will do to Absalom's sister. And again, we wonder if Amnon did it for political reasons, to embarrass that other family, or for lust reasons, and maybe it's a mixture of both. We're just not sure. Let's look at this tragic account, beginning in chapter 13. Now, it was after this that Absalom, the son of David, we learn from chapter 3, verse 3, that he was the third son, and he was a son by a princess of Geshur, G-E-S-H-U-R, and had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. Her name meant date palm. And Amnon, the son of David, that's the half brother, son by a different mother, the firstborn of David, loved her. But the word loved here is not what it seems like. It's more animal lust is what it is. And Amnon was so frustrated because of his sister, Tamar, that he made himself ill, for she was a virgin. Now, the idea of her being a virgin, if you pick this up with verses 6 and 9, it seems to mean that she was always surrounded by matrons and people watching her and never alone. And that's what seemed to frustrate him. He never could find a time alone with her. There's been some question about could he legally have married her. According to Leviticus, he could not, but we're not exactly sure how this was working in the palace at the time of David's reign. And it seemed hard to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. Now, this guy is going to be a nephew of David, a son of one of David's brothers. Matter of fact, this other son here is the third son of Jesse. Now, boy, this friend is going to give some shocking advice. He's going to occur later in the pericope also in advising Absalom, and here he's advising Amnon. Exactly his motive is unsure, but it certainly was a dastardly deed. Notice what he says. And he said to him, "O son of the king, why are you so depressed?" The Hebrew means lean, the opposite of fat. You just look peaked, boy. What's the matter with you? Morning after morning, will you not tell me? And Amnon said to him, "I am in love with Tamar, the sister of my brother Absalom." And Jonadab said to him, "Lie down in your bed and pretend to be ill." He already looked ill. Maybe he was not that much pretending. This boy was lovesick, in a sense. "When your father comes to see you," isn't that interesting? The king would come see his 6 sons. That says something of the kind of father David was. Now, he's going to really blow it as far as keeping control of his sons. Maybe because of the guilt he felt in his own childhood and his own actions as an adult. But it's not that he didn't care for them. He apparently did care for them very much. "When he comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me some food to eat, and let her prepare the food for me in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" Apparently, there was maybe watching her prepare it would make it more appetizing to me, or maybe there was some superstition about a virgin's cooking was more vital. I'm not real sure exactly what the background of this is. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make me a couple of cakes." Now, it's interesting here. The word make seems to have a dual meaning. It can mean make, but it's used in Song of Songs, chapter 4, verse 9, to mean sexually aroused. And there seems to be a play on the word here. Make me a couple of cakes. Well, that's interesting. The word commentary has dumplings And the reason it has dumpling is because down in verse 8, it's the word boiled, and it's tough to boil a cake. This Hebrew word has caused us the miseries. It's some food item, but exactly what it is, we're just not sure. In my sight that I may eat from her hand. And David sent to the house of Tamar, saying, Go now to your brother Amnon's house, Amnon, and prepare food for him. And Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was lying down. And she took dough and kneaded it and made, there's that word again, cakes in his sight, and boiled. Now my New American Standard has baked, but the Hebrew Masoretic text has boiled. And she took the pan and dish them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, Have everyone go out from me. Now that may sound at first a little suspicious, but this same exact phrase in Hebrew is used in Genesis 45:1, where Joseph asked all his Egyptian servants to go out when he's talking to his brothers. So it's not automatically a harsh phrase or a negative phrase in that sense. Then Amnon said to Tamar, Bring the food into the bedroom. Now apparently there was one large room partitioned only by curtains. And so the place where she cooked the food was really not all that far and not that different from where his bed was lying. Because apparently he was lying on his bed sick and could see her cooking the food in the earlier verses. So probably a petition of some kind of material is what we're talking about here. And when she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, Come lie with me, my sister. But she answered him, No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. What she's saying is this is not appropriate. This is out of bounds. Do not do this disgraceful thing. This word disgraceful is used of something to be appalling to people. And he was the crown prince, and he couldn't act like this. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you'll become like one of the fools in Israel. Here was the crown prince acting in such an immoral way. This word's used several times for really stupid acts that people do. And what she's saying to him is, you're going to jeopardize your claim to the throne by this. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. Well, there have been two theories here. The rabbis say that she said this only to buy herself some time to get away from him. That's certainly possible. The other theory is that this was not considered incest because they had two different mothers, and somehow the king would allow this. As you know, Abraham and Sarah earlier in the Bible were half-brother and sister. And so maybe the admonitions of Leviticus were not followed or not well known or whatever, but we just can't be certain. So we're not sure it's literal. The king would let them marry if he asked, or if it was simply a way to bide time and try to escape the situation. By the way, the place that this is forbidden would be Leviticus 18, verse 9, Leviticus 20, verse 17, and Deuteronomy 27, 22. However, he would not listen to her, since he was stronger than she. He violated her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, for the hatred which he hated her was greater than the love which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, Get up and go away. Two very strong imperatives. Isn't this amazing? He has violated his sister, and now he has to marry her. That's the law of Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29. This is the kind of thing that lust does. It's the strong desire to dominate another person. Now, we're not sure if it was just purely sexual passion or if it was something political here about him embarrassing Absalom, his rival's family. We're not sure. But notice how fast this emotion of extreme lust changed to extreme hate. Maybe those emotions are closer than we want to think about. And so she protests. She said to him, No, because this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you have done to me. Yet he would not listen to her. Putting her out like this, a reproach, would be far worse than handling it now appropriately. Then he called his young man who attended him and said, Throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her. Do you catch the animosity now? Oh my, it's unbelievable. Now she had a long-sleeved garment. This is a Hebrew word we don't understand really. It's the same kind of word used for Joseph's coat back in Genesis 37, verses 3, 23, and 32. Some say it means long-sleeved. Some say it means multicolored. And we're just not sure. But it was a sign of what the virgins wore from a very young age, especially the royal virgins, the king's family. For this was the manner the virgin daughters of the king dressed themselves in robes. his attendant took her out and locked the door behind her. And look what Tamar did. She put ashes on her head. It was a sign almost like a widow dying. She knew what would happen. She'd never be married now. And it's the mourning of a widow, maybe. She tore her long-sleeved garment, which was on her. She put her hand on her head. Now, what does that mean? Maybe it's a symbol of God's hand is heavy on me. Maybe it's a symbol of a heavy burden that I bear. And from Jeremiah 2:37, it's a sign of great grief. It's obvious that she realized what was going to happen to her. And she cried aloud as she went. It was obvious a display that would attract attention. Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" You think he had an inkling here? Was it the way she was acting then? Or was it the way that Amnon had looked at her when they ate together at the king's table before? I'm not sure, but it seems that Absalom knew what happened either by what the sister was doing or the way Amnon had acted earlier. But keep silent, my sister. He is your brother, and do not take the matter to heart. So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Now this may be irony, this may be sarcasm, it may be his attempt to say, let's keep it in the family. I'm really not sure, okay? The King David heard of these matters. He was very angry. Yes, he was angry, he just didn't do anything about it. That's the problem. The Septuagint adds to this verse, "Yet he did not punish Amnon, his son, for he loved him because he was his firstborn." Now the Septuagint adds that to explain he was the crown prince. David didn't know how to handle his own rebellious children. This is part of the curse that came upon him because of his sexual impropriety with Bathsheba and his terrible treatment of Uriah the Hittite. But Absalom did not speak to Amnon, either good nor evil. Now that may mean either he refused to speak and publicly rebuffed him, or it may mean he just didn't bring this subject up, but he kept it deep in his heart, saying, one day, I'll get you. He either play act or he showed his contempt. We're not sure which this word means, because he violated his sister. Now some say this was the reason, others say it's the political thing that is also caught up in here, and honestly we can't tell from the text. But now it came after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers. Now we learn from several places in the Bible that shearing sheep was a time of great festival, great partying. We see it back in Genesis 38, several times in the Bible. It was a time of fellowship and party and revelry, really. In Baal Hazor. Now, this is not Hazor, the great Canaanite city north of the Sea of Galilee, because it's on the border of Ephraim. So some say it's a city we're not real sure about, but close to the border of Ephraim. And Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king and said, he's going to say, David, why don't you come? I'm having sheep shears at one of my places. It shows he had land holdings of his own. The king said, no, that's not appropriate. He said, well, let your sons come, at least let Amnon come. And David questions him about this. Why should he go with you in verse 26? Apparently, even David had some inkling that there was some bad blood here. Maybe because Amnon didn't talk to Amnon or Absalom didn't address him. We're just not sure. But finally, the king gave in, and that's the whole problem. Let's see. And Absalom commanded the servant, saying, see now. But there's a little addition to verse 27, the Septuagint, that says, and Absalom made a feast fit for a king. Maybe there's some more political implications behind that. I'm not real sure. All the king's sons went, and Absalom made a deal with his servant, saying, when I tell you, when he gets drunk, and I say you kill him, you kill him. And don't be afraid, because I am one of the king's sons, and I've commanded you to do it. And so they do that. In verse 29, all the other sons are terrified. They jump on their mules. Now, mule is a royal animal, what the kings ride. You all see 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 33, verse 38, and verse 44. Now, mules were not allowed to be bred in Israel because of Leviticus 19:19. I think it's 19:12. And so they were probably imported. It was a royal mount. And then this word comes back to the king in verse 30 that all his sons were dead. How did this report get back before the sons got back on their mules? Many say that this Abinadab is somehow in cahoots now with Absalom as he had been in cahoots with Amnon. Maybe he was a confidant to the king's sons. Maybe he knew what was going to happen, and that seems to be the only way he explained that all the sons aren't dead. How did he know all the sons aren't dead? Unless he knew something of Absalom's plan, or maybe of Amnon's fears. I'm not sure. But he said to the king, don't worry. But this may have been a plot by Absalom to say, he's going to think the worst, and then when he hears that all of his sons but one are safe, it'll make psychologically be less of a shock that one son is dead. That may be true. We just can't be certain about it. Let's see. Notice that Absalom killed him in a place. He was north of the city of Jerusalem. He fled back to his grandparents' place in Geshur. It's a kingdom to the north in the Transjordan area. And he's going to stay there. You can see that in verse 37. It was his mother's father that he went to. Now in verse 39 it says, "And the heart of King David longed to go out to Absalom." Now that's probably not a completely accurate translation of the Hebrew. The word "go out" in the 1339 and the word "his heart was inclined" in 14:1 normally in Hebrew have a negative connotation. And I think we've in English made this too positive. I don't think David had gotten over the death of Amnon. I think it was festering in him. Because even when David's going to bring him back, he's going to put him in house arrest and not even speak to him. So I think you ought to watch those translations of 1339 and 14:1 and not it be so positive. And maybe you want to check your different English translations here. Now Joab, of course, Joab was a relative and the commander of the army. Perceived the king's heart was inclined toward Absalom. Now some think it was negative, and he was worried about succession. And he felt like this man who was in line for the throne ought to be somehow reconciled to the court. Maybe that was it. Many have felt that Joab always acted from personal interest. That may be true. It's very strange here how positive Joab seems toward Absalom, and yet later in the chapter they're going to have some bad blood when Joab won't come to Absalom when he calls him. And it's Joab that will finally kill Absalom when he finds him hanging in the tree. So Joab sent to Tekoa and brought a wise woman. There's been much speculation. Maybe Tekoa was a place where wise people were known from. But that is simply speculation. Maybe it's just a woman who was known for her wisdom. And what Joab wants is a play actor. He wants somebody who can play a part. And so he sends for this wise woman. Maybe David knew of her. We're just not sure. "Please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments now. And do not anoint yourself with oil," a symbol of mourning, lack of oil. "But like a woman who's been mourning for the dead many days. And go into the king and speak to him in this manner." Now this shows that the king really acted as the judge of Israel. People had access to the king. They may have to wait in line. They may have to wait a long time. But they could get to the king to put their grievance. Now the woman of Tekoa spoke to him. This is almost a parable because it's certainly not true. And this is the story she tells. "I'm in grief now because my husband died and I had 2 sons. My 2 sons were in the field by themselves. They got mad at each other. One killed the other one. Now the community has raised up a community goel, a blood avenger, kind of like the state versus an individual. And they want to kill my only remaining son. And she pleads with David that if they kill my son, my whole inheritance will be cut off. And the law should not be pushed in this instance." Now some say we get from this idea that David was the community goel for the nation of Israel. That may be true. It's certainly obvious that he was the final authority. And so this woman goes through all of this rigmarole about this. You see the blood avenger mentioned in verse 11. Now remember, this word goel is one of the names or titles used for God. It was, in Israel, there were 48 Levitical cities. 6 of them, 3 in the Transjordan area and 3 in the Promised Land area, were called cities of refuge. And if you killed a person by accident, you're still responsible for the eye retaliation of the Jews. And so the family would raise up one of their strongest men to pursue you and try to kill you. But if you made it to one of these 6 cities of refuge, and they held court there, and if they found out you truly were innocent, it was like manslaughter instead of premeditated murder, you could remain in that city and be safe. You could bring your family, and you had to stay there until the death of the reigning high priest. Then you could go home. But if you left that city, and the blood avenger found you, he could kill you. Now, I think this is why when it says, "Thou shalt not kill," in the 10 Commandments, it really should be translated, "Thou shalt not commit non-legal premeditated murder." For there was a legal premeditated murder, this goel. Now, this is the same term, goel, that could be used of a kinsman who was rather wealthy, and some of his family got sold into slavery, maybe for lack of payment of debts. Maybe they were prisoners of war. Whatever reason, they were imprisoned. And this near relative would come and buy them back. It's called in Hebrew, redeeming them. Now, this act of redeeming or buying someone back from a near kin became one of the words used to describe God's love for us, a near kin's love as He purchased for us our freedom. So it came to be a metaphor for the forgiveness of sin. Now, here the blood avenger is the other side of that same term. Notice the little phrase, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son's head shall fall to the ground. This may be the Old Testament allusion to the thing on the Sermon on the Mount about God knows the hairs on our head. It's obviously an oath formula, as the Lord lives, which refers to the covenant name of God, Yahweh, which is the Hebrew verb to be from Exodus 3:14. I think it should be understood as I am the ever-living, only living God. And that's this oath here. Now, David was caught in this parable much like he was caught in the parable of Nathan. As Nathan told the story about the man with one ewe lamb, and it was obviously a reference to David's taking Bathsheba from Uriah the Hittite when he had so many women in his own harem. This parable David got caught in too. He is more gullible than his son Solomon will be. He gets caught up in this and says, I'm going to protect you. You're doing the right thing. I'm going to spare this boy. He shouldn't have to die. And this woman says to him, now, King, I have one more thing to talk to you about. Please don't be mad. I've got one more thing. And he says, what is it? And she even starts flattering him in verse 17 by saying, let the word of my Lord the King be comforting as the angel of God. We're not exactly sure theologically how in the mind of Israel the angel of God was perceived. Was he perceived as a counselor? Was he perceived as a physical representative of God? We're not just sure. But here's an example of the angel of the Lord and the king being identified. And notice it says in the end, and may the Lord your God be with you. Again, here's this oath wish for David's understanding and judicial wisdom in this particular matter. And so I think you can see that. Now, notice if you would, where it mentions here, that David's caught and she says, if this is true, if you're forgiving my son, why are you holding it against your son? And boy, David says, this sounds like Joab. Now that meant that Joab either was a favorite, a friend of Absalom, worried about the kingdom. David knew it sounded like him and said, has Joab been talking to you? And she says, yes. Joab put me up to this. And so David said, okay, I see the wisdom in this. Bring the boy back. But look what it says in verse 24. But let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face. So I think here we see that verse 24 reflects the negative aspect of verse 13:39 and 14:1. He was under house arrest, if you please. Now all in Israel there was no one as handsome as Absalom, so highly praised, and then from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no defect in him. Now this is a way of saying he looked kingly. He was tall like Saul. He was handsome. He was highly praised, highly thought after. Okay? This deal about his hair is interesting. Some think there's been a scribal error because it weighs so much here, it'd make his head fall to one side. It may be a foreshadowing of how he's going to die, his long black hair caught in a tree as his donkey went under it. The other thing is, the rabbis even say he was a Nazarite. I think that's not true, but it is a rabbinical way of saying this long hair was somehow a symbol to the Jews of his spirituality, going back to Numbers chapter 6. The fact it mentions his sons here and one daughter named Tamar, apparently named one of his daughters after his sister. The mention of his three sons is surprising because in chapter 18:18 it says he had no sons. Either his sons all died young or they were somehow killed as punishment for his acts. I'm not real sure there. Notice in verse 28 and following, Absalom's tired of his 2 years in house arrest, sends for Joab, and Joab wouldn't come. Why? We're not sure. He seemed to be friendly earlier, and now he's not. Maybe he knew Absalom better, and whatever. We're not sure. So Absalom just sets part of Joab's field on fire. It happens to be next to him. And Joab comes and says, what is the deal? And Absalom says, look, I want you to go talk to David. I want to get out of here. I don't want to be here anymore. I want you to get me out of this house arrest. It even says in verse 32, it'd been better if I'd have been put to death. That's an exaggeration. But anyway. So when Joab came to the king and told him, he called for Absalom, And he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. This may be the thing, the word kissed here is where the other people get the idea that David's heart was inclined toward him. But a kiss was a typical Oriental greeting. You would do it to a father and son, even if you were so mad at them you could spit. So I don't think this does show a kindly inclination. It shows that David was afraid of this boy. This boy had shown tendencies of acting in personal interest and acting very violently and acting against the wish of his father the king and taking advantage of anybody who stood in his way, as he just did to Joab in his field. And so I think they saw the tendencies there. Maybe David was remembering the curse that was going to be on his own family because of his sin. But for whatever reason, this sets the stage for the growing tension and separation between Absalom and David. And the next chapter will deal with Absalom's military invasion, and David had to flee. Well, that's the account, I think, that it expresses in many ways some the tragic results in David's family, the incest, the jealousy, the rivalry for the throne, the many people hurt in this thing, the manipulation of Joab behind the throne. All the political intrigue of this must have been unbelievable. And yet it was the prophecy of God that it would happen. It also shows you can't listen to some counselors either. This is pretty bad advice this man Jonadab had. He seemed to be a wise person, but he was wise in a negative sense. Be careful of your peer group. That's another truth through here. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. God bless you.